Hello there, and welcome to the Special Ed Leaders Podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Maren Boothby. She is the CEO and founder of Boothby Therapy Services, and I've had the opportunity to have some really incredible conversations with her. She is such an innovator and problem solver in the SLP space, and I'm really excited to dive into some of the things that she's been up to, especially her workload calculator. I think that's a really interesting conversation for district administrators to hear about. She also consults with school districts and helps them navigate changes. And this little bio does her no justice. So I'm going to turn it over to Maren so that she can just share a little bit of her story with us before we dive into some of the other things she's up to, including the workload calculator. So hello, Mary.
Hi, it's great to see you, and thank you so much for that nice introduction. I'm excited to share about our workload calculator and tell you a little bit about what we're doing at Boothby Therapy Services.
I'm really curious to hear just more about your story. So you started off as an SLP, and then how did you end up here as the founder and creating all these solutions?
Right. So when I was a new SLP, my passion was brain injury and stroke. And I actually started working in a rehab setting, and I really did love that. But I did feel a little bit burdened by some of the pressures of working with insurance companies and constantly working to get approval for my clients to have more units. And that just became more and more of a burden over a few years that I was working in the rehab setting. The productivity requirements were high, and I thought to myself, there's got to be a better way to do this. Meanwhile, I was living in New Hampshire. We had a dearth of speech pathologists available to work in schools, and I was receiving phone calls from a tiny little school all the way through the National Forest in New Hampshire saying, hey, can you come help us? And I decided, I can, and there's a better way to be a speech pathologist, and I'm going to do that. So I left the medical setting. I headed into schools. I was excited about working with kids, and I thought, I'm going to do this the right way. So I have to thank the folks at Waterville Valley for introducing me to special education and all of the supports they gave me as I learned how to become the school-based SLP. So I did that. Shortly after that, I was then in a full-time capacity working in schools. I did that by myself for a few years. And then about 3 years later, there was just so much demand, so much need, people calling me all the time. And my husband, Christopher Boothby, who's also one of the founders of our company, said, hey, we need to start employing some other people. So we decided to do that. And that was the beginning of Boothby Therapy Services as a larger group of really, passionate SLPs and providers who are all about helping children succeed.
I love that. And where is Big Therapy Services at now? What does the company look like?
So we've really grown. We're in our 25th year delivering school-based services in New Hampshire and Maine. And about 8 years into our company, we bought an occupational therapy services company and really dove into that. And we have found over the years that our school partners are really looking for one-stop shopping for their contracting needs. Their jobs are so complicated. They want to have a provider and a partner that they can trust. So over the years, we've expanded to also provide school psychology services, teach with the visually impaired, orientation and mobility, counseling, and special education teachers. So it's just been this really awesome partnership as we've just tried to become the comprehensive solution for our school partners.
That's amazing. And you do way more than just offer people to fill the roles. I've just been so impressed in our conversations. You are such an innovator and problem solver. You have some really creative solutions when it comes to supporting staff development and workload and other problem solving. But can we chat a little bit more about the workload calculator and how that came to be? What led you to develop that, and what does it look like?
Absolutely. That is one of the things that I am most passionate about. And I'd love to share that a little bit with you and your listeners. It really started for me in 2002. That was early in the time that we were delivering services on a bigger scale in New Hampshire. And that was the year that ASHA published their workload caseload position. And that position basically states that SLP caseload assignments should really be based on workload, not on the numbers of kids, so that you're actually taking a look at what the needs of the students are. So at the time, my primary concern was making sure that I was making sure that each of the contracts that we were serving had enough time, not just to see the kids deliver their direct services, but also to make sure that the SLPs were able to develop IEPs, attend meetings, do new referral evaluations, triennial reevaluations, and to do all the compliance work that's needed, the Medicaid documentation, the quarterly progress reports, and all of those things. So the ASHA workload caseload position is fantastic. It's detailed. They provide lots and lots of tools, but those tools are somewhat complicated, right, to apply on our own. So I started taking apart the ASHA workload caseload analysis, and I made a spreadsheet on Excel, and I was trying to figure out, how do I plan all this time? And eventually it got to be our own proprietary software, which we called the Data-Driven Needs Analysis, or the Data DNA for short.
I love that. And so I guess we have a pretty good idea of what the workload calculator tells us. It looks at all of the aspects of our role and kind of what to expect. And what are the benefits of calculating that? Like, what problems does it solve, and how could that benefit a school district?
Absolutely. I mean, I really feel for directors of special education or student services, because they are running a huge special education program with all the related service providers, the school psychologists, the special ed teachers. They have so many things to comply with. Most of them are not themselves speech pathologists. I wish I had a dime for every time someone said, I'm not a speech pathologist, but. So what they need, especially special ed administrators, they tend to have more special education teachers in their districts and in their buildings, and they have OTs or speech pathologists, for example. Meanwhile, we're in the business full time. All we do is related services and special education. So the benefit for a district is they're able to dial in on what exactly are the needs of their speech and language caseload, or of their occupational therapy caseload, for example. So it begins with, how many kids do we have? But then it goes on to look at, and what are their services? Are they individual or are they group? How much group time can we reasonably plan if that's not already prescribed in the IEP? And then, which kids are due for triennial reevaluation? Are we doing trimester progress reports, or are we doing quarterly progress reports? What does the compliance look like in our building? What does the Medicaid documentation do? Do I need my speech pathologists to be team leaders and do 30-day reviews for my Medicaid to schools program? Do I need my speech pathologists and occupational therapists to also do duties? Do they need to serve on committees? What's the time requirement? Now, it's difficult to even identify what all those needs are, never mind plan for that time, but see, what is that? Is that a 3-day-a-week job? Is that a 5-day-a-week job? I'm not sure. So the great thing is we can take all that data, plug it into our data-driven needs analysis, and put out, hey, this is what the job looks like. This is the number of hours you need per week. This is the number of hours you need for the year. The places that I have found it to be most helpful is when districts are looking at a significant change. Either they're adding a building or they're consolidating buildings. So they're moving from having like 5 elementary schools down to 4. So they have staff that they can reassign. Or perhaps if they are adding a program like a preschool program or an intensive needs program. So it's a tool that really helps them dial in what the needs are, and it gives them data that they can speak to their stakeholders about, their business administrators, their superintendents, and their school board members.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the biggest hurdles, is just like whether you're hiring an employee or a contractor or working with a company, and just knowing exactly what you need. So if you have this calculator and it gives you a report of, okay, this is exactly what we need, then we're much more likely to be set up for success.
Exactly. And there's a high level of accountability for special education administrators, too. From this data DNA, right away, it generates a budget.
Mhm.
So, they have a good sense of what their costs will be. It gives them the data that they need to be speaking to, again, the business administrator, superintendent, school board members, and so forth. And importantly, talking to SLPs like us so that when they make staffing decisions, they can say, yes, I've planned for this time. Yes, I've looked at the progress report writing time. I'm confident that there's time for you to do this job with excellence.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot of, just in my conversation with administrators, it sounds like there can be a revolving door of contractors. And
Mhm.
do you think that the incorrect calculation of workload is a huge factor in that?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that a lot of times I feel like some of our school partners, they're coming for the first time to us with an emergency. Oh my gosh, I have an unanticipated vacancy. I have someone who's out on medical leave or has a leave of absence. Help me. It's a desperate situation. I need to meet the needs of these kids. That's no one wants to be in that situation, of course, right? But that's the world we live in. Like, we're all people and emergencies happen. What we love is when we have this kind of ongoing relationship with the district so that we can plan ahead. And what we find is even when our company is maybe doing 20 or 30% of the services in a district versus, some of our clients will have 70 or 80% of their services contracted, we can look at the total resources in the district. Hey, let's look at all of your speech paths across the district. Where are the caseloads ebbing and flowing? I'm sure you've seen this yourself, right? Like, there's a bubble of kids in fourth grade. Like, you've got this giant group of kids, right? And you need more resources. But meanwhile, maybe your middle school SLP has fewer kids that year. Perfect opportunity for her to come down and help that elementary level SLP. How does that look? What parts of the job are easy to break off? That's where, again, the data DNA can really provide some guidance, because it may be, hey, that new referral piece would be a perfect piece to delegate to the helping SLP, because there's not already an existing relationship with the primary SLP at that level, and so on and so forth. There are just so many ways to look at it. And when you have all the data in front of you, it makes the staffing decisions just easier.
Yeah, and it's a great problem solving tool in using optimizing our current resources.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, in the process of looking at caseloads to create the data driven needs analysis, we're able to also get a gauge on some real key factors that impact efficiency. So, for example, in New Hampshire, we need to prescribe whether the services for kids will be group or whether they'll be individual. But in Maine, that's not required. We don't do it that way. It's kind of to the discretion of the provider and based on the student schedule. There are some advantages to that approach, but an administrator wants to ensure that an appropriate amount of group service is being provided for a lot of reasons. One is efficiency, but it's also less restrictive than those individual groups. So, taking a look at that and the percentage of time that's going to be delivered in a group setting also really drives efficiency too.
Yeah, and if we're using the same calculations for a CF versus an SLP who's been in the field for 30 years, do you find that some SLPs have a hard time, whether regard what in terms of experience or other factors?
You've got to take in
Mm.
all those factors, and they're factors that are related to the provider, and they're factors that are related to the building culture as well, right? So, I mean, the data driven needs analysis has several standard planning allocations of time planned in. So, for example, we might typically plan 15 minutes to write a progress report that includes rating scale and a narrative. But if you're in a school that only requires rating scales, then that could be done in 10 minutes. Or if you're in a high needs program with medically fragile kids or kids with autism, or kids that have some kind of behavior needs, you may need more documentation. So you had the ability to customize the playing time, maybe to be like 20 minutes, for example, for a progress report. And the same thing can be true, as you said, for the different providers. Really experienced people are going to have an ability to fly through the work in some levels, whereas a new one, not as much. And even I've talked to so many directors who know their providers and their SLPs, and they say, hey, I know that this person really needs extra time for, preparing their evaluations or their IEPs, or this person's participation in our meetings is really essential. I want to make sure they're there for the whole time instead of just reporting out at the beginning. So we can customize all of that.
Yeah. And it sounds like your company does a really great job with staff development. Do you have strategies or supports in place to help optimize like SLP's productivity and like kind of matching the timeframes in the workload calculator?
Yeah. Well, so yes, I think that professional development and consulting work with our school districts is one of my favorite things. And it's kind of led to some of our very best kind of partnerships and relationships. I say we're full time in the business of delivering related services and things like identification criteria when you're identifying kids as having a speech and language disorder. Of course, that varies from state to state. Some states have a very, very well defined criteria, and some states have a more open criteria. So, how do you achieve consistency across your district with how those decisions are being made? It's such an essential role for the SLPs, and it has such a massive impact on caseload numbers and costs for the special education budget. I guess that would be the one thing that I would say to a special ed director is, if you're not 100% sure that your speech and language pathologists are identifying students as being eligible for speech language impairment with consistency and accuracy, that's the biggest, easiest thing to look at in terms of, efficiency and making sure that we're giving the services that kids need to the kids who need the services.
Yeah. And that can be so. I've had a lot of conversations on the podcast with attorneys and just kind of the legal side of special education. So that's critical for productivity and all of that. But it's also huge in terms of compliance and
Yeah,
avoiding litigation and due process and all of that, which is a huge productivity and
absolutely.
budget sink too if we end up going down that route.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't want to over identify, nor do you want to under identify. One of the strategies we've come up with is a decision making tree. So, to make it as visual as possible, to lead a team through the process so that, whoever's at the table, parents, case managers, advocates, can understand the decision that's being made, and that SLPs who are maybe new to the role have something to kind of fall back on and guide the conversation.
Yeah, and that's invaluable if the SLP or the OT or whoever the provider is, if they're appropriately trained in that, that can have huge impact for districts.
Absolutely. I find that especially at the preschool level, it's even trickier for the identification decision. We have so many little ones now, at least in the Northeast, we're certainly seeing just a huge need among our 3, 4, and 5 year olds for sure. So getting that eligibility criteria dialed in is super important.
Yeah. Well, I think I can see so much value in appropriately calculating workload and just the benefits that that can provide to a district administrator and having that clear data to share with the team and justify their decision making. And then also just setting up the providers for success. And ultimately, I think all of our goals are ultimately to provide the best possible services for our students. And this is such a great way to make sure that we're doing that.
It is. And, as you go through the year, this is something we do for every SLP and every provider in our company. It's a great tool to guide how people are spending time. So when you have somebody who's new to your building or new to the role, it's a chance to say, hey, let's take a look at that data DNA. how much time were we allotting on a weekly basis for your testing time, for your therapy time? Well, let's go take a look at your schedule. Like, do you have evaluation time reserved in your schedule? Do you have time for how much time are you scheduled for therapy, and how does that compare to what we planned for? And it really can show us where things can get tightened up, and it gives some really valuable guidance to how the whole year unfolds.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I love how, because it sounds like that consulting piece is kind of baked into the work that you do with districts.
Yeah.
And so that's I feel like that's probably not super common.
Yeah, we're kind of on a mission to kind of share what we know and what we've developed so that people can use it. I mean, we've got these tools. If they need to be customized based on a district's location and state regulations or their own particular, policies, we can do that. But man, I just like to get them out there and share them. The eligibility criteria, the dismissal criteria, how to identify with young preschoolers, and for sure the data DNA. And I think most of the SLPs I've talked to about the data DNA, they just love knowing, hey, all my time is planned for. I have the time I need to do my job with excellence.
And it makes it really, because I know I've had roles as an SLP where it was kind of unclear exactly what the expectations were. So this is a great way. I think SLPs especially really, like, just from the SLPs that I know, they really appreciate that clarity, and like knowing what the expectations are is really empowering.
Right? That organizational streak is a mile wide
I
in
love.
us as SLPs.
Oh, this is amazing. Is there anything else that you wanted to share around like workload or the consulting or the problem solving piece?
I just love that you gave me a chance to share what we're working on. I appreciate that our providers are using SLP Now and the tools that you have to help them be more efficient with their lesson planning, which is something that's important to make sure that we're having those quality lessons. And the data that your tool provides is really helpful as well. Yeah, you could get me on a roll going about consultation topics and working with special ed directors. I have a lot of respect for them and empathy for the challenge that they're facing in our public schools. But it's just it's great to have that partnership. So
Yeah.
thanks, share.
Yeah, I love that. And if a special ed administrator is listening to this and is super inspired and feeling like they could benefit from consultation or services, what's the best way for them to learn more?
So I would definitely direct them to our website at www.boothbytherapy.com. And we have a special tab that's for school partners. And they can go and on that menu, data driven needs analysis or data DNA page, that they can find more about it. And we would love to do an initial consult and even a demo for them to, hey, let's look at one of your schools and see how the tool works for you and try it out, and then see if it's something that they want to use on a broader scale.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and expertise. This was super helpful. And yeah, thank you to everyone who joined us for this episode as well. I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me.